Alright everyone, for our saint of the month, I really want to talk to you guys about a saint that's pretty apt for this time of year, right? We have August coming up, harvest season, we got Lammas, we got the Feast of the Assumption, we've got all these things to celebrate harvest, and who better to talk about than not one, but two patron saints of farming, rural community, and, cattle. And those two are Saint Isidore and Saint Maria de la Cabeza of Madrid, Spain. So the reason there are two saints is because actually Saint Isidore married Saint Maria, right? So Saint Isidore was a poor farmer and he worked for John de Vargas, and this was around the Middle Ages, so the year like 1070-ish, 74 is when Isidore was born. He died in like 1100 and maybe 30 or so. He died around that, lived and died around that time. And of course, as a farmer, he was a pretty poor man, so he didn't have a lot. And when he married Maria, who was then Maria Turiquia, it was kind of the same idea, right? So neither of them ever had very much. They had one child, and unfortunately that child died as an infant. But all of their hardships aside, and the poverty aside, the hard life of rural community aside, they managed to continue to hold this really spirit of prayer and mercy and faithfulness, and they would share everything they could with their neighbors. And so, Saint Isidore, he would go to the church a lot. He would pray so much that he'd actually be late to work a lot. People would complain that he was always showing up late to work. However, no matter how late to work he was, he always got all of his work done on the farm on time. And people believe that honestly 2 angels came with him to help him plow the fields so he could still get all his work done even though he spent so much time praying. And he would pray not only at church, he would pray even while he was plowing. He would pray all the time while he was out there in that hot, beaten Spanish sun. So he was an extremely devout man who cared a lot about prayer, communion with God, and all those other kinds of things. But another thing that's really, really cool about both of them is that Maria would always have a pot of soup on the stove. She would always have something cooking on the stove because Isidore had a really, I'm not going to say bad habit, but a really big habit of bringing anybody who was hungry over to the house. Anytime someone was hungry, Isidore would invite them over, and even though they themselves had very little, the soup pot would always have something in it for other people. And in fact, we can draw a parallel here between the story of Jesus and the bread and the fish, and the story of Isidore and Maria, because there was one story where Maria said, I don't have enough soup for all these people. We're at the very bottom of the pot here. I've got a couple spoonfuls left. And Isidore said, well, look in the pot again. And she did, and she managed to scrape up just enough soup for every single person from what looked like just a couple spoonfuls. So it's very much that kind of food multiplier, that feeding everybody who came in there with virtually nothing. We think of Jesus and the apostles, they only had, 6 fish and 2 loaves of bread, and they fed 4,000 people with that. That repeats again here in the story of Isidore and Maria. Isidore also cared very much about the welfare of animals. He really wanted animals to be treated well, and he was very kind to, the animals that he would plow the fields with and other such things like that, which is why he's associated with, ranching and cattle. And interestingly, Maria, her name, de la Cabeza, the head, is because her head, her skull, is actually a relic in Spain. And there's a lot of folklore belief that her head brings rain, that it can, in fact, be like an attractor for rain in times of serious drought. And, that's because of Maria's, intercession, because her relic is rooted there, so she brings that kind of help for, in response to people's prayers by bringing their prayers up to God. All in all, though, I think this is a really fascinating couple of saints, and I think anyone who has a garden, especially if their garden's kind of struggling a little bit like mine is lately, I think this is a really great, not only one saint, but pair of saints to, get into that more rural living, harmony with nature, getting that soft heart towards the plight of others, and getting that real spiritual connection with God. Because they were so focused on prayer and living a good, holy life, they are really good to ask for, getting connected with God again and getting back into a rhythm of prayer and keeping prayer and, God at the front of the mind. They're also, really, really good at helping with, of course, animals. So we always think of St. Francis for, helping with animals, but St. Isidore and St. Maria, they had a lot of animals, being farmers, and because of that, they also have some ideas of how to treat animals not only just like as pets, but also as colleagues, as peers who work with you in the fields, right? Because a lot can be said about the fact that, yeah, we work really hard, but so do farm animals. Farm animals work very, very hard. The oxes that pull those big, heavy plows over the field. I mean, even the cow and the chicken who don't really do much by way of plowing, they still provide food, and that's still something to hold value in and to respect them for. And again, those gifts of charity, you always hear it said, right? The poorest people are going to be the ones that give the most, and Saint Isidore and Saint Maria absolutely show that to the extreme. They had pretty much nothing, but they would always give whatever they had, and they always had something. There's a lot to be said about the idea that, you know, God provides for those who provide. If you give even from the very last bit of your wallet, it comes back to you. The universe, God, however you want to see it, they see that charity and they respond in turn. It's an ever-giving cycle, right? We hear that phrase, money comes back to me, right? So it's always that idea that never deny a hungry person food, because first of all, it's just not right to do. It's not right to look at someone who's hungry and not feed them. But second of all, things come back, and it's a good thing to do for others. If you'd want people to care for you that way when you're hungry, you should do that for others as well. So Saint Isidore's feast day is on May 15th, and Saint Maria's feast day is actually on September 9th, which is my birthday. So that's pretty interesting. And if you want to mark your calendars for either one in the coming year, Saint Isidore may be really interesting, actually, their timeline. Saint Isidore before we start with our gardening season, Saint Maria after the gardening season, when we're starting to wrap up the harvest and, you know, get those last fruits of summer, now that autumn's coming through. Overall, two really interesting and fascinating saints, and just complete sweethearts as well. And I think there's a lot of place for them in, you know, your everyday tradition, especially if you want to connect back with the land, if you want to open your heart up to being more charitable and more connected with God. Fantastic duo. So, with all that said, thank you guys for tuning in, and I will see you to have our next sermon-style conversation in the next couple weeks. See ya. By the way, if you want to see these videos 2 weeks earlier, consider subscribing to my Patreon, where you not only get all these videos, but also recipe cards, specific deity profiles, and lots of other interesting things to look at. Video tiers start at $10 a month, so definitely consider checking it out.